Hi, I'm Ethan, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the method and science behind cooking a medium rare steak. Now normally, we tell the doneness of the steak by cutting it open and seeing how red it is inside. The science behind that is that the red color of the steak is given to it by a protein called myoglobin. When you sear the steak, it turns brown because the myoglobin is being denatured and no longer gives off a red color. The myoglobin denatures at around 90 to 100 degrees Celsius. So we're going to be shooting for an internal temperature of 60 to 65 degrees Celsius for a medium rare steak. The first step to cooking our steak is going to be seasoning it. Now, for today, we're going to do a simple preparation with just salt and pepper. So it's important to get a pretty generous, even coating on the steak. This is a pretty thick steak, so it will be worth seasoning both sides of it pretty thoroughly. Rocking with freshly ground pepper. It's usually a little bit better for flavor, especially when you're going to be heating it up. And then flip it around to the other side. And do the same thing. Now, while we're letting the steak rest, let's talk a little bit about the importance of salting your steak and letting it rest before cooking. Water makes it harder for the surface of the steak to raise above 100 degrees Celsius, since this is the boiling point of water. For what we're trying to do, we need the steak surface to go well above 100 degrees Celsius. So it's imperative that the surface of the steak is as dry as possible. We're also going to go out to the herb garden to get some thyme to go with the butter for when we're basting the steak. Now, the primary reaction that's going to be taking place when we cook this steak is called the Maillard reaction. It's often used when talking about cooking anything. Really anything that browns in the kitchen could be described as the Maillard reaction. But in reality, the Maillard reaction is a pretty general term. It just has to do with sugars and proteins combining when activated by heat in order to form new compounds. And each particular food, based off of the specific types of proteins and sugars it has its own particular flavor palette. This is what gives food its taste. Okay, so the first step of cooking after seasoning is heating up both your cast iron skillet and your oven. We're going to be doing the simple sear method as opposed to something like the reverse sear method or sous vide method. So basically, for your pan, just make it as hot as it can possibly go. And for your oven, you're going to want to preheat it to about 150 degrees. We're going to be using grapeseed oil to cook, as opposed to something like butter. And the reason we're going to use grapeseed oil is because it has a higher smoke point. Now, when referring to any sort of fat, a smoke point is the point at which the fats that make up the oil or the butter begin to burn and smoke. And for something like steak, we need something with a very high smoke point to avoid that. So, for the cooking process, what it's going to look like: oil in, steak on, we're going to allow it to flip once, and then we're going to add our butter. Like I said, we're going to start by putting in the grapeseed oil. And now, we're going to wait just a moment for little wisps of smoke to start appearing on the surface of the oil. And as you can see, we've been heating this one for a while, so it's already going. So that means we're ready to get going. So here we have our steak. If you look closely at it, you'll see that it's a little damp on the top. We blotted it down, and that's actually the myoglobin coming out. It's not actually blood. But we're ready to put our steak in now, and we're going to begin to sear the first side. As you can see, a little bit of a splash, that's the residual water coming through. Basically, we're going to give it a minute to sear before we toss in our butter and the thyme that we picked up from the garden earlier. It's gonna cook very fast, so we're gonna take a look at it and see how we're doing already. A little bit longer, but like I said, almost there. We're gonna get our butter and our thyme ready, and it's gonna go in immediately once we flip our steak. All right, here we go. We're going to flip our steak and toss our butter in to begin basting it. And as you can see, there's a browning occurring on the steak, and that right there is the Maillard reaction. We're going to toss our butter in with our herbs and allow the steak to baste with the butter. It's important to tilt the pan. Slightly in order to be able to baste the steak properly. Remember, the pan is very, very hot, and the butter is actually going to be browning. Now, as a comparison, this here is the Maillard reaction. This would be beyond both the Maillard reaction and caramelization, which means it's going well past 300 degrees Fahrenheit and is starting to burn the milk fats within the butter. Whereas the proteins within the steak can experience the Maillard reaction, but there's not sufficient sugars and proteins in the butter in order for this to occur. So, as you can see, around the edge of the steak, we still have a bit of pink, but the steak is very nearly ready to go in. Let's take a look at the bottom here. The bottom's almost ready. We'll give it just another minute. You can keep basting the steak in the meantime. And basically, the basting of the steak is just going to help it keep a little bit more moisture and add a little bit of flavor from the butter and the thyme. And that's another Maillard reaction right there with the thyme. All of those aromatic chemicals that exist in the thyme are being transformed when put in the heat with the butter. It's almost, think of it like an activation energy sort of thing. The activation energy is the heat, and it's activating the chemicals in the steak. Now we're just about ready to throw this in the oven to finish off the center. Yup, we're looking pretty good. So we're gonna open up the oven. We're gonna toss in our steak. We're shooting for, like I said before, 60 to 65 degrees Celsius. If you were shooting for higher than that, you'd leave it in longer. We're gonna just check temp when we need to. So we've checked the temperature, and it's at our desired temperature of 130 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 to 65 degrees Celsius, and it's about time to pull it out now. So remember to be very careful when doing this. It is extremely hot. Pull the steak out. And now we're going to transfer the steak onto our cutting board quickly. Leave the pan to cool. And now, it's important to let your steak rest. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna cover it with a little bit of aluminum foil and let it rest for 5 to 10 minutes. The importance of resting the steak, there's some science behind it. When the heat encounters the steak, it makes the muscles very tense, and they tend to contract a lot due to the heat. So when you allow the steak to rest a little bit, it allows the muscles to sort of relax and makes the steak a lot more tender. Another thing is it involves keeping in some of the moisture of the steak. And that's something that's important to talk about, especially as it relates to science. The moisture of the steak primarily does not consist of the water content that existed in the steak before we cooked it. It actually has to do with the fat that was in the steak before, or the marbling, as it's sometimes referred to. That, much like butter, melts. So at a certain temperature, the fat within the steak melts, and that is the moisture. So in chemistry terms, that would be the melting point and a phase change for the reaction. Then also a couple more points while we wait. What we did here is essentially just an example of the Maillard reaction. The steak contained both sugars and proteins that were necessary for the Maillard reaction to occur. It's a multi-step reaction, and it varies in thousands or tens of hundreds of thousands of different ways for all sorts of different foods that have different sugars and proteins prior to cooking. And what we did is we took this steak that contained those things and we brought it up to over approximately 148 degrees Celsius, and that's the range where the Maillard reaction can occur at a rapid pace. Alternatively, the Maillard reaction could occur at a slow rate if you were doing something like making a stock, where if you added a lot of water and a lot of time, you would be able to get the Maillard reaction to occur, and that's what would give a sort of meaty or umami flavor to any kind of stock. But in this case, we wanted it to go very rapidly, so we made sure that the surface did not have water so we could get to that temperature quickly. We made sure that the surface was at that temperature that it needed to be, and we had the right ingredients. And those, all in all, are the ingredients required. This would be the reactant side of our reaction if we were to make this into a chemical equation. And that's all we need to come out with a steak that's been affected by the Maillard reaction. All right, so now that we've let the steak rest about 5 to 10 minutes, it's time to cut into it. Now, if we did our job right, there should be a red to pink center, aka, like we talked before, the myoglobin has not been affected by enough heat in the center for it to denature and turn this color, brown, the brown color of steak, and the Maillard reaction has not taken place yet in the center of the steak. So if we did our job right, we should see something approximating medium rare in the center. And lo and behold, it looks like we did a pretty good job. So as you can see, around the edges we have some browning. That is the Maillard reaction, but in here, all that myoglobin, which often is mistaken for blood, is still in there, which is exactly what you look for in a medium rare steak. Now, the whole reason that we went through all that effort and we discussed all that science about how to get the steak to look this way and why it looks this way is, of course, for the taste. So it's important that we taste the steak. After all, none of this was worthwhile if it doesn't taste good. So we'll slice off a piece. And because we rested it, the steak is still very tender. So here we go. And the steak is very good. Let's get a second opinion. Here's Winnie to help us taste test. It looks like we did a good job. And there you have it. With just a couple of ingredients and a few short minutes, you have steak with a side of science that's guaranteed to impress. It might just even help you make a splash at your next dinner party. Well, there you have it, folks. Tune in next time I have an AP chemistry project, and so long for today.